1, 2. 2, 2. Testing 1, 2. Test 1, 2. I wiped its card too, so I hope there wasn't anything like... Well, I briefly looked before I did it, and it was just like Martina me. That was a clearance cough. That wasn't a cough. It was a clearance Praise Chapel Fresno, and all those you tuning in, wherever you're tuning in at, whatever you're tuning in on, we're just glad you're here this evening. We're still in our letters from Paul, still going strong with that. Wednesday nights are still live casted only. There's still been some questions about that when we're going to open it up. What we're going to do is, again, this has been in discussion with our senior pastors, so live casting only on Wednesdays. But we'll keep you guys updated with things that are coming up as changes. We still don't have our overflow room that would normally have available for those that maybe want to participate in a service, but might be uncomfortable with the amount of people that might show up on a given Sunday morning. That room is under construction right now. We're setting it up for our Sunday school to be able to do both in-person Sunday school lessons, as well as continuing to complete a Zoom meeting that goes on with kids that parents might not feel comfortable coming back to service just yet. So just like we're doing it here in service, we're doing that for our children as well. So as you can see, as much work as, for those of you that have been here, you see how much work it takes to get a single Sunday service up and running. We're doing that ×2 now so we can get our Sunday school up and running and make sure that the kids that are still at home and social distancing are still taking part in the great programs that we have available for them. So that room is under construction at this point. We don't have it available for our overflow. So I did have a text I had asked if it's available. So again, it's not going to be available from this point on. Once we finish with our Sunday school construction, we'll find another way to get a room available that people can come to if they want to continue to come to service, but might not feel comfortable. But again, that's all in the works right now. So just please bear with us at this second so that we can get everything kind of up and running. It takes a lot of work up front to get something running real smoothly and easily. So we're putting all that work in right now so that we can make sure that when we open our Sunday school back up for our children, that they are still socially distanced, they're protected, but that we also have a Zoom meeting and the way that that's happening so that the kids at home can still take part in what's going on. So again, this does take finances. This does take a lot of support that's coming through, so you can give your tithes, your offerings, your love gifts via EasyTithe on your smartphone app. You can also go to easytithe.com, search Praise Chapel Fresno. It'll show you which one you can give to. You can go to praisechapelfresno.com, click the menu button in the upper right-hand corner, go down to where you see Give. It'll take you to a safe and secure website that you can contribute on. If you're joining us at our in-person services, we still have our offering envelopes available with the tithes and offering box available right outside the sanctuary for you to drop it off in. Still trying to maintain, contactless giving if we can. So that's still available, or you can mail in, drop off your tithes, your offerings, your love gifts at the physical address of our campus. If you don't know what that is, go ahead and Google Praise Chapel Fresno, California. You'll see our address that you can drop it off, you can give to, and we'll make sure that it gets deposited in a timely manner. So as we said, we're still in our letters from Paul. We're still in the book of Philippians. So a lot is going on with what Paul is writing to the church in Philippians. Now, this letter that's being written that we're reading about can be described as a very joyous letter, that Paul is expressing how pleased he is with the church. He's expressing how much he appreciates their continued support, these kinds of things. But Paul, the book of Philippians, conveys one very powerful message, and it's about the secret of contentment. See, Paul's not talking about, in the context of a letter that he's writing, he's under house arrest and he's going to have to go before Caesar, and he's going to be tried for just being Paul, for doing what he's doing, spreading the word of God. He's going to be put on trial for this, and you know what, could lead up to execution. So Paul finds himself yet again in imprisonment. So he's not writing about and telling him that he's happy about what he's doing. He's saying he's found contentment with where God has brought him to. He faced several hardships, poverty, beatings, illness, current imprisonment, but in every circumstance, he learns to find contentment. And what he tells the church, what he's telling the church in Philippians, isn't that you have to be happy about where God has brought you to. He says, I find contentment because I know God is at work through my conditions. God is at work through my circumstance. And he's telling them he finds that contentment because he allows God to change his perspective. And that's something we're real good at as humans. We like to find the worst possible outcome and focus on that. And I'm always in that mindset of plan for the worst and hope for the best. And again, Paul isn't saying that is a wrong mentality. He's saying, but when you're focused on the worst and you won't focus on what God is trying to show you, that's where we fall. And so he says that finding contentment is about allowing God to change your perspective, to bring other things into perspective while you're in the midst of these circumstances. And he always tells him, he says, there's a lot that you can be thankful for, and he understands that the hardships of life cause us to really kind of stop focusing on the joys that God has brought into our life, and that's really easy to do. I find myself doing that on a daily basis. Some of us, we may be in a circumstance in our work, and we get frustrated, we get upset, forgetting all along that this is the same job we prayed for 3 months ago, 6 months ago, a year ago, praying, God, please open these doors. He opens them, and we get there, and Paul says it's because we're too focused on the errors, we're too focused on the problems than we are on the fact that God is still at work through these miracles, through these things that he's brought into our lives. And so Paul is taking the book of Philippians and he's basically telling them how to change their perspective. So we're continuing. We're going to be in chapter 2. We're going to be wrapping up chapter 2. So we're going to start in verses 12 and 13. And he says this, therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you both to will and to do his good pleasure. One of these scriptures and one of these verses is one of the most debated throughout all of Christendom, throughout all of religion. This verse gets pulled and it gets talked about, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. I'll go into it a little bit, but that one, as I started researching into it, that is more like a 3-part lesson of teaching what Paul is meaning, what this means to us today, and how to apply it to our lives. It was a very complex theological discussion that gets involved here. So I'll kind of briefly go over it, but I found a great avenue to be able to go into these things. But so Paul is commending the Philippian church for their integrity at first. And he's telling them that, when I was there, you were doing good things. When I left, you did greater things. And he's happy about this. Not only have they followed the teachings of Christ when the times were good or bad, but they've held to their faith despite any issues that they have faced as individuals as well as a congregation. So there's a man that's been communicating with Paul about the Philippian church, so he knows that they've been going through things. He knows that they've been going through hardships individually, but both as a congregation. And he's telling them that you're doing far greater things than I had anticipated, and I know you're going through hardships, so that just makes me even more proud to sit here and say that I am part of this, that you are part of me, because he's saying you've done such good works even through your circumstances. He's telling them that they're living a faith that is lived out loud. He's telling them you're doing this and the world is watching. There's no greater time that the world was watching us when we went through the shutdown. There is no greater time that the world is continuing to watch what churches are doing and how they're doing it. And Paul says, even in the good and the bad times, we should still be doing it joyfully. We should be happy about what we're doing. We should serve with contentment because he says the world is watching and we have to live our faith out loud. Work out your own salvation. So I'll go over this briefly, but Paul isn't telling them that you have to earn salvation. If we look back to the Colossians letter, to the Ephesians letter, he's not telling us that we have to work for our salvation. More, Paul first wants to remind us that we have to put real effort into our lives. So he's saying when you become a Christian, you just don't walk around and say, well, God's going to do everything for me. He says there is still a work that has to be completed. Now it says that Christ has completed a work in us, but we know that we still have to live our lives. We know our lives are incomplete. We have to continue to work towards the will that God has placed in our lives, and we have to work for that. And he's saying you don't have to work for salvation, but you have to work in your life. You have to continue. It's a conscious effort. That Christian living doesn't just happen. It takes effort to see our faith evident in every aspect of our lives. This tells us to give attention to our own salvation. See, it's not that we come, we bend our knee, and we say, okay, I'm saved, and I'm saved forever, despite what I do. We know that we can turn away from God, and we know that we need to turn back towards God, bend our knee yet again, and declare him Savior over our lives yet again. It's not a once saved, always saved type mentality. It is I have to maintain my own salvation on a daily basis. And I'm telling you, there have been times daily, I'm literally praying, like, God, I'm so sorry I've done this. Like, I don't even think I'm saved anymore. Why have you called us to this? And it's just to a point that we feel that we come back to Christ. We come back to God whenever we feel like we've stepped outside of some line that God has placed in our lives. And that doesn't mean it's the same line for everyone else. And that's kind of what this comes to. Work out your own salvation. People say, well, that means what my faith, your faith may be the same faith, but what I feel is wrong, what you feel is wrong is different. That comes down to personal opinion. Not going to go that great into detail into it, but it's saying that God puts certain requisitions on people's lives that they have to live above reproach, that we're called to a higher, we're called to a higher standard of living, would say. And those that are in ministry, those that are leaders, those that are elders are called to an even higher standard of living because they're watched, because they're looked at, because they become an example that people might model their lives after. And so that's part of that. But this tells us to give attention to our salvation. Sometimes we show great concern for the work of God in others and not enough of our concern for our own lives. So Paul's telling them, you don't focus on someone who might be falling and saying like, well, you're falling, you're this, and ignore the fact that, you're doing the same thing. He says, don't point out, the splinter in someone's eye when you have a beam through your own eye. He's saying we need to be concerned about others' lives, but we also need to take care of ourselves. We need to take care of our own salvation. We should care about the souls of others, but this care must begin with our concern for our own soul, for our own salvation. Paul's telling us not to measure our faith against one another. He's saying don't walk up to one another and say, well, I went through this and I didn't do anything. What did you go through? He's saying that it is God who will ultimately judge each individual, and that we should speak and guide others, that we should speak to guide others, but that constant voice of reassurance in their lives to follow the voice of God for the will of their lives. See, and I think what we're trying to say here when we read this is that Paul's telling them, don't try to guide other people's faith. Don't try and guide them to things. You need to uplift them and tell them it's them that needs to search. If he says work out your own, he means it's each individual that is going to be responsible for finding the will of God in their life, for listening to that voice for God. So when they come to us or we go to them, it shouldn't be to a point to say, well, I did this, you should do this. It should be like you should be seeking that voice. This is how I seek. Maybe that would help you. But to constantly guide them back to doing it themselves, constantly guiding them. You need to be praying. You need to be searching for that voice. Don't just depend on my voice. Don't depend on the voice of others to say, this is what God wants me to do with my life. You need to pray, seek, look, search, and you'll find it. And that's what Paul's saying. Work out your own. Take ownership of your own salvation, of your own life, and say, I'm going to seek to see what God wants me to do with my life. And it's not wrong to model after this. It's not wrong to model this. Most of the apostles were modeling Jesus Christ. We're told we're Christians. We have to be Christ-like. We model our lives after Christ. So that's our ultimate, that's our ultimate model that we should follow. But it's not wrong to look at other people and say, well, I like what they do, but he's saying it has to be from you. Don't speak the words that I've told you to speak. Speak what God brought into your life. Speak what God is bringing through your mouth. Listen for the voice of God in their lives, but it's you that have to actively search for the direction that God is leading you to. We're responsible for that. And Paul says, work it out yourself, that you can come and you can ask questions of elders, of leaders, of pastors, and say, I don't know, and we can help guide you to what you need to do to find what God wants you to do with your life. But don't come up to someone and say, what does God want me to do with my life? That's between you and God. You ask God the questions, I guarantee you he's going to answer. Then he brings up fear and trembling. A lot of people say, God says he hasn't given us a spirit of fear, but a power, love, and peace of mind. And that's all true. What we're talking about here when we talk about fear, when you work out your salvation with fear and trembling, the concept addresses a worshipful respect for God. As a child, even as an adult today, I still have a reverent fear of my Father. And it's not to say I'm scared that he's going to do something against me. I'm scared that he's going to lash out against me. It's you have this concern that you want to do good by him. You want to do good. You want him to be pleased with the work that's going on. And that's what Paul is saying here, that we should have this concern for the work that we're producing for God, that we should be concerned about where we're at with our lives so as not to displease, but to make sure that we're doing everything possible that we can with what he's given us so that he would be pleased with the work that we've produced. It doesn't have to be a fear of hell or damnation. Instead, it is a righteous and all-filled reverence of God that every believer should have. And you can kind of, you can say, like, this is the kind of, the world today would say, well, it's a respect, or I'm starstruck. If they were to come into contact with one of their favorite movie stars or music producers, if they were to come up to him, you would be awestruck. You wouldn't have anything to say. Some people just scream. But that's the same thing that Paul's talking about, is that we should have this concern that we want to please them. We want them to see that we've done good, how much we love them, how much we love him, and how much he loves us. And that's what Paul's saying. It's not that we should be afraid of God. It's not that we should be so afraid of God that we're shaking. It's that we should have so much reverence for what he's doing, what he's done in our lives, and what we can do with what he's given us, that all we'd want to do is please him. All we want to do is him to be just grateful for what we've done with what he's given us already. Doesn't have to be trembling of a guilty sinner. Instead, it's a joyful trembling of an encounter with God. And you'll see it quite frequently when people pray. Sometimes a hand will constantly shake, these kinds of things. This is what he's talking about. He's saying you're in the presence of God, and sometimes you can't help but just shake. Sometimes we've been so happy with the situation that your body just trembles, your body just shakes. Or, it's not just about fear, it's about a sense that you are in the presence of something that you can't comprehend, but you just are joyful about it. God's work in you, when Paul uses this, he means God just doesn't enter our hearts and do nothing. So we're saying first we have to work out our own salvation, then he brings up God's work in you, denoting that we are working and that God is also still at work. He doesn't just come, fill us with his spirit, and then say, okay, I'm just going to chill here for a minute. He continues to work. He's constantly at work with his spirit that continues to fill our lives. And Paul tells us that if God is at work within us, then we have a responsibility to continue to diligently work with what he's given us. 14 verses 14 through 16. So he's kind of talking about all this work that has to happen, what we have to do, what God is already doing, what he's going to do. But then he brings up verses 14 and 16. And he says this about our work. Do all things without complaining and disputing, that you may become blameless and harmless, children of God without fault in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as the lights in the world, holding fast the word of life, so that I may rejoice in the day of Christ, that I have not run in vain or labored in vain. So the complaining and disputing, he brings it out. A lot of people, bring that up to arguing inside of a church, arguing amongst one another. That's all part of it. But what Paul is doing, what he's writing here, he's using a very familiar phrase that Jew and Gentile would have picked up on if they had been following the teachings of Christ, if they'd been reading, the texts that have been passed down from generation to generation, which are basically common knowledge. He's using a very frequently used phrase that was used to describe Israel during their exodus: the disputing, the complaining. And he reminds the church what this kind of behavior can lead to. Complainers and disputers. If you've ever come across one, someone who is constantly saying, I don't like this, and someone who is constantly saying it should be done this way, complainers, disputers, they're not there to help you. They're not there to help the church. They have no concern for you. They have no concern for the church. They're not trying to help, because complaining and disputing comes from an attitude. It's a mindset of discontent. That is a human emotion. And all they look to do is to spread that attitude. Nobody likes being unhappy by themselves. That's a psychosociological term. Nobody likes to be upset by themselves. They want others to be upset about the same things they're upset about. They want others to be as concerned about certain things as they're concerned about. And when you're not, it becomes kind of a quarrel within them. Why are you not? Do you not understand? These kinds of things. So Paul is telling them that you get someone in a building that does that. You get someone within that's coming to you, and all they're doing is complaining or disputing what's going on. He says they're not there to help you, because they're coming from a human emotion. They're coming from a place of personal opinion, not God-led words. Excuse me, sorry. Complainers and disputers, not there to help. It's okay to voice when we may be displeased with something that we've seen, as long as we go to those that can correct the problem. And that's biblical. You take your issues to the people that can correct. Paul says it's not wrong to be displeased with something that happened, but you need to go to those that can make a correction. You need to go to those that are basically in charge and let them know what you're displeased with. But then you have to understand that what you may be displeased with comes from a personal view, when others may be following what God is telling them to do. So Paul is saying complaining and disputing means, okay, I may be displeased, but when they tell you, well, this is why we feel we're doing it this way, or this is why we decided to do it this way, to begin to argue with it now becomes a dispute. It becomes a personal issue, not so much that you felt like it might not have been from God. They explain to you why it is, or why they felt it, and then you begin to argue with that. That becomes a dispute. So he's saying it's okay to bring it, as long as you bring it to those that can make correction, and then let it go and just say, if I let you know what I was displeased with, I let you know what happened, and I believe you're going to take care of it because I'm following. I know that you're hearing from God, and this is what you've planned to do. So I've let you know what's wrong, and if I'm wrong, let me know. But you'll take it from there, and that's what Paul's saying. We bring it up to those that can make correction. Blameless and harmless. Now that kind of comes out with this living above reproach, right? So through the display of a non-complaining spirit, we show ourselves to be true followers of God. So he's saying that those that just come and do what God has asked of them, or what others have asked of them that just do it, Paul says live a life above reproach. That just means live a life that no one can point out and say, see, that's what's wrong with you, or that's what happened that caused the problem. It gives no one any room to blame us when something in their life goes wrong. Harmless, we should seek to do no one any harm in our lives. Doesn't mean that we're weak or that we should be unwilling to fight for our beliefs, fight for our faith, but we shouldn't be lashing out at others with the intent to harm or cause strife. So he's saying it's not wrong to protect yourself. It's not wrong to fight for your faith. It's not wrong to fight for your beliefs. Stand on them and say, I will not be moved from this because this is what God has called me to. But he says we should do that from our stance, but then those that are coming at us, we should seek to do them no harm. Despite what people are saying, despite what people do, he says just stand on your faith and say, I'm sorry, I can't be moved because this is what I believe. But he says when they turn around, don't attack. Like we shouldn't attempt to provoke people into attacking us or provoke people into getting a response that we can attack on. He says, just stand on your beliefs, be blameless and harmless. Stand on your faith and say, I will not be moved because this is what I believe. Live a life on those beliefs. And then he says the harmless is, don't attack anyone. Protect yourself, protect your faith, stand on your beliefs, but don't lash out at people. Don't jump down on them and say, this is, I disagree with you, and I think you're dumb, and I don't think you know what you're doing. He says, that's the whole strife, that's the whole thing that you're causing harm. It's okay to come up to someone and say, I just don't understand what you believe. But let it go from there. Let him explain. You're not going to move from your faith, but we shouldn't be lashing out at people. Then Paul brings this up, labored in vain, which I thought was kind of curious because he's telling them they're doing such a good job, and then he's like, so I wouldn't have labored in vain. I wouldn't have run in vain. Paul uses this to remind the church of the direction of our work, or of the direction of our work should be completed. We can work for the church. We can labor to see events or the expansion of a church. But Paul reminds us that the true work that is never wasted, is completed in changing the lives of others. He's reminding them, you can do all this other stuff. You can have a successful building. You can have all of these other things that are going great. But if you're not changing lives, your work is in vain because it's never going to change anyone's life. That he says our true focus should be in the changing of other people's lives. That they walk through the doors and they walk out feeling different. That they walk through these doors, they come and they listen to worship. They listen to what the word that's being preached, the word that's being fed. And when they leave, they are thinking about things differently. They are deciding to live differently. He's saying that all is for naught if all we do is meet together in a building, have some fun, talk some truth, and people leave and say, I'm never going to change anything that's happening. He says it doesn't matter how big it is, doesn't matter how small it is, as long as you are changing the lives of the people that continue to come to your church, that continue to seek God. Paul tells us that true work is never wasted when lives are being changed. For everything we do as a church, if it's not focused on actively changing lives, Paul tells us it's in vain. That we're never going to see the results that we want because you're not focused on what God says is the true work, and that is the changing of others' lives. And we look at verses 17 and 18. And he says, yes, and if I'm being poured out as a drink offering of the sacrifice and service of your faith, I am glad and will rejoice with you. For the same reason, you also be glad and rejoice with me. So Paul he's talking about religious practice here. He's bringing up something that both Jew and Gentile would understand. He's talking about the Jews and the pagans when they would make their sacrifices, which isn't required within the New Testament. That's Levitical law. That's kind of going back to that rabbinical law that's there, that they pour things on offerings. The Jews, they would pour out wine or sometimes perfume on their offerings that they're burning. They would pour it beside or on, they would pour it on the side or on the outside of the sacrifice. The pagans would pour it on their sacrifice to whatever gods they're sacrificing to. So he's bringing that kind of thought to this, and he's telling them, like, if I'm going to be poured out for your faith. So he's kind of bringing this to a Debbie Downer situation where he's saying, if I die, I would have poured myself out for your faith. I would have gladly walked to this and have been poured out of my spirit just to see your faith continue. And that's kind of where he's coming from. He's just alluding to that whole sacrificial system of what's going on, and he's letting them know that. So he's saying, if I'm being poured out, that his death would only make their sacrifice and their faith stronger. Because if you look back, if you read in Leviticus, you'll find out like what was required to be poured out, why it was required to be poured out, and it would just make it that much more potent of a sacrifice. And so Paul's telling them, if I die, if I get executed, that should only strengthen your faith and make it far more potent. It should make it far more easy to spread to others. See, Paul looked forward to what might be his imminent death, what we call martyrdom, and expected that the Philippian church would be glad and rejoice with him if he was executed while standing on his faith. Paul wasn't being morbid, but he's asking the Philippians to take joy in something as depressing as a death. Our church just experienced the death of a longtime member, and it's hard to find joy in those kind of situations. But I've said it before, I've been in rooms of those that are believers that have passed, and there's such a peaceful passing that happens. It's such an amazing thing that transpires in that room, when someone is passing. And we find joy in that, knowing that they stood the test of time, they've ran their race, and they've stayed true to the faith, and that they're being walked to the gates of heaven by Christ himself, hand in hand. So Paul's telling them, don't be sad if I die. Because it should strengthen your faith. It should make it more potent. And you should be happy because I've done all that I can and God has now called me home. But he did ask them to see his death as something that would still bring God glory. It wouldn't be a defeat, but that it would be a victory. And then the last two sections of this are kind of weird. Not weird in the sense that it doesn't belong there, but just Paul frequently will do this in his letters. He will focus in on specific individuals, and he'll kind of talk them up midway through his letters. So verses 19 through 23, he talks about Timothy. He tells the Philippian church that he's going to send this man Timothy. Now, he doesn't give him an exact time or date. He says in God's time, in God's way, he's going to come to you guys, and he doesn't want there to be any trouble from the church. Now, he knows the Philippian church has been nothing but helpful. They've done nothing but want to help Paul spread his ministry, so he knows that they're going to accept him, but it's kind of like parents going on vacation telling their kids, okay, now don't act up. Like, they're not going to in one case or another, but you're just kind of reminding them of these things. So he's telling them, Timothy's going to come. He's going to be with you guys. So just do what you're doing and accept him. But he tells the church that Timothy's going to be more than just a visiting person. He's going to be more than just a visiting pastor or visiting elder, because Paul has such a deep concern for the sheep of this church. He has so much of a concern more of them than himself. And Paul understands how rare it is to find a heart like that, to find a heart of someone that says, I would rather see other people succeed than myself. I would rather see people build them, I would rather build other people up than see myself built up. And he knows that's really rare. And he knows the Philippian church is doing well, but he wants to send someone over that can bolster that can just come in and begin to ignite a fire. Should Paul, be executed, he knows that Timothy's going to be there, and he's going to turn that perspective. He's going to keep them focused on God, and that he's going to push them even harder, because all he wants to do is see them succeed. And then verses 25 through 30, he talks about this man, it's Epaphroditus. He talks about this man is likely the one who's delivering the letter. This guy was sick. Paul reminds them, he tells them, he was very sick, even unto his death, but God provided in his mercy. So, he kind of goes over that. But then Paul tells the church then, and he tells us today, that we should have a heart, that there is something lacking in our service until the job is done. He talks about these two men, and he says they're going to do everything they can, even into their death, to see that the job gets done. The perspective Paul is guiding the church to is focused on love and unity amongst the believers. Love and unity. That doesn't just mean we have to be together. That doesn't just mean we like being around each other. It says we long to be around one another. He talks about focus on love and unity amongst believers, amongst ministries, and amongst all Christians, that we should show selfless affection for each other. And that's kind of the wrap-up of chapter 2. So we're still continuing these. We'll keep doing them on Wednesdays. You can continue to give, tithe, love offerings, whatever it may be, to this church via EasyTithe on your smartphone app. You can also go to easytithe.com, search Praise Chapel Fresno, and you'll see the website that you can give on. You can also go to praisechapelfresno.com, click the menu button in the upper right-hand corner, go down to where you see Give, click it, and it'll take you to a safe and secure website that you can continue to financially contribute on. Or you can, if you're joining us on our in-person services on Sundays at 10 o'clock, you can drop off your tithes, your offerings, your love gifts at our tithe and offering box, or you can leave it with us. We'll make sure it gets deposited in a timely manner. But we love you guys. We're so excited. We're still just doing live casting on Wednesdays, but just stay tuned for updates. We'll be putting them up on our website, social media, all that. We love you. We can't wait to see you guys on Wednesday. Have a blessed night.